Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to 10.3. Today we're going to talk about another tajweed concept. I know I haven't mentioned it up to this point, but tajweed are rules that you would use specifically for reading the Qur'an. You would not use these tajweed rules when it comes to just having conversations in Arabic. The reason why we use tajweed, these special rules, for example, in the previous video we went over qalqala, is because that's the way that the Prophet ﷺ himself actually used to read. And the reason why he read it that way was because that was the way Jibreel alayhi gave it to him. And the reason why Jibreel alayhi gave it to him with tajweed was because that was how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recited it to Jibreel alayhi salam. So that's how important tajweed is. We want to make sure that we're incorporating these tajweed rules. They're not just for show, they are actually important. So try to get the hang of them as best as you can. Before we go ahead and get started on this page, there is one more lesson that we do need to learn, and that is a rule called Ikhfa. So what is Ikhfa? If you look at this box over here, you have this alif and noon connected, and then you have this ta. So ideally you would recite it anta. However, the rule of Ikhfa states whenever you have a noon with a sukoon on top of it, so here's a noon, right? And there's that little sukoon on top of it right there. We call that a noon saakin. Whenever you have a noon saakin, you have to do three things. Number one, you have to hold the noon sound for about one mud. Remember that little thing I taught you, right? The one alif, the one mud. Number two, while you're holding it, you need to feel vibration in your nose. Okay, you should feel a little bit of a vibration, so it does become a bit of a nasally sound. And number three, you're actually going to hide that noon sound. Okay, you're actually going to hide that final sound. So those are the three things. Let me show you what they actually sound like. This would be pronounced anta. Notice how I held it. Anta. In that phrase, I did all three. I held it. Right? I felt that in my nose. And finally, if you pay attention, I did not say anta. Okay. My tongue did not fully touch the roof of my mouth. Instead, only the sides of my tongue touched the roof of my mouth, but the middle of my tongue was left hanging. Okay. So once again, listen very carefully. Anta. Okay, let's look at another example where you have a noon saakin. Right below it, there's a kaf connected to a noon saakin. In this case, you would say kuntu. Okay, let's look at one more down here. Okay, this would be pronounced anzir. Okay, so remember, that is when you stretch it out for about 1 second, 1 and a half. You want to make sure that's coming from your nose. You feel that nasally sound. If you're not doing it from your nose, try to get that little air coming out of your nose. And finally, you want to be able to hide that last N sound. You don't want to say, so if you look at the first one, you don't want to say anta. Okay, you want to try your best to avoid doing that. You want to say anta. So this seems pretty straightforward. However, there is one more rule attached to it, and this is where things can get a little bit tricky. You do not always do ikhfa when there is a noon saakin. In other words, it's not always the case. Remember, here's that anta, right? The anta. What decides whether or not we do ikhfa is completely dependent on what the letter after the noon saakin is. Okay, in this case it's ta again. In this case it's ta again. Down here it was dal. Okay, what determines whether or not we do ikhfa again has entirely to do with the letter that comes afterward. There are certain letters that if they come after the noon saakin, you would not perform the ikhfa. You would not hold it down. I'm going to go back to the first page and I'm going to show you what those letters are. So here we are back at the first page. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to circle the letters that if they show up after a noon saakin, you would not perform ikhfa. So there are a few of them. You are going to have to want to pause and memorize these letters before you move on. Again, the letters I'm about to circle, if any of these letters appear after a noon saakin, you would not perform ikhfa. Here we go. Alif, ba, ha, kha, ra, Ain, Ghain, Lam, Mim, Noon, Waw, Ha, Hamza, and the Yaz. Those are all of the letters. If they show up after a noon sakin, you do not do ikhfa. This is probably one of the trickier rules to remember just because there's so many letters to know, as opposed to qalqala where there was only 5 letters. This one has a lot. Good news is, for the most part, whenever there's a noon sakin, most of the time you will not see all of these letters. The majority of the time it's probably going to be ha, kha, ain, um, maybe a ha every here and there, or a hamza. Otherwise, for the most part, most of the time those letters won't even show up after a noon sakin anyways. It's better to know all of them in the event that any of these letters do show up after that noon sakin. Another place where we do ikhfa would be whenever there is a tanween. Whenever, again, there's the 2 fathas, the 2 kasras, the 2 dhammas. Remember, we called them fathatain, kasratain, dhammatain. Let's go back to that page. So whenever you have tanween, you would also perform ikhfa. So in this case, you would have this. It would properly be pronounced man. The next one would be min, mun, and the cycle continues. Again, the same rule applies here. If any of those 13, 14 letters that I circled on the first page shows up after a tanween, again, you would not perform the ikhfa sound. So just to recap of what we covered today, we went over ikhfa, and you would perform ikhfa in 2 different situations. Number 1 is if there is a noon sakin, and number 2 is if there is a tanween. Now remember, the only time you would not do the ikhfa, right, even if there is that noon sakin or that tanween, is if any of these 14 or 15 letters shows up afterward. If any of these letters shows up afterward, remember, it is crucial you do not perform the ikhfa. I realize this is like half the alphabet you have to memorize for, what it is, unlike qalqala where it was only the 5. I told you guys in the introduction, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's okay if it takes time. It's okay if it takes, some time for you to get the hang of it. Inshallah, it will actually come to a point where you'll just be so used to it, you won't even have to think about what letters you would perform ikhfa with or not. But please, please, the important thing is you do not rush yourself just trying to get it all in, trying to finish as quick as possible, because that's not how it's going to work. Take your time with it. Learn these letters, learn them to the best of your ability. And then once you know them, then we can actually move on to lesson number 11, where we're actually going to put the ikhfa and the qalqala into practice. That's going to do it for me, guys. As always, please keep me in your du'as, and inshallah, I'll see you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.